Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. So today's session is part of Esade Stay Connected platform, through which we offer different webinar sessions covering current issues that will be available through the website of Esade, also through YouTube and LinkedIn channels. The aim of the webinars is to share academic knowledge, but also experience with you all. So we are very lucky today to have with us Francesco Marzoni, Group Head of Data Analytics at Nestlé. Francesco has a huge experience in transforming large multinational companies into data-driven companies. First with P&G, Procter & Gamble, as a global division head of IT analytics, if I remember correctly. Then with Bayer, as a VP for data analytics, and now with Nestlé. Francesco, welcome. Can you tell us about your profile and your background?
Hi, Manu. First of all, thanks for having me. Yes, glad to share some thoughts both about the background of the industry in this journey in analytics, and also on what is keeping us busy at Nestlé as we continue our journey towards turning the biggest food company in the world into a data-enabled cognitive enterprise. So as you mentioned, I've been in the data analytics space for basically for forever, since I started in my professional path. And I think the passion that I have for data really was well matched by the strong evolution that we had in this space in the past 5 to 10 years. And if I have to tell you briefly what is really keeping us busy these days at Nestlé is about one, building on a strong heritage that we do have, where the company has really invested a lot in building relevant global data assets, especially I have to say in the supply chain and operation space, to make service to the internal and external stakeholders more and more relevant over time. But also a strong heritage that the company has in managing scale, in managing large scale of operations, as well as, for example, a number of users of the different data landscape in the company. So what we want to do now is essentially to accelerate further in this journey, building on this strong heritage that we have. And I have to say, our journey towards becoming a cognitive enterprise is really structured into mostly 5 building blocks. The first one is around talent and culture. That's key. We do know that there is no digital acceleration, there is no data value if we do not invest in our people, in upskilling or in reskilling or in driving the right data culture foundations in the organization. The second building block is really about having the right operating model for us to operate at the scale that we need to operate in a company of more than 300,000 people, with an equally high number of external partners that work for us to deliver value for consumers and for the community in which we operate. And then a third building block, which is really about having clear analytics use cases portfolio that have clear ties with how we create values, again, for both our businesses and our communities. 4, it's about data assets and how we take our data foundations from being strong data foundations, functional area by functional area, to becoming integrated data foundations that really serve the whole enterprise value chain. And then last but not least is about the whole let's say technology landscape that really allow us to exploit all the potential of the new technologies on the data analytics space, which is about then building a clear roadmap of analytics workbench, data platforms, rather than integration platforms that are really future-proof, let's say, for our ambitions with data.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and promising introduction, because the topic of today is to raise the game in analytics. And you said, you have this heritage of culture, plus the big ambition to scale initiatives in a very large dimension company. So I think it will be very, very enriching and interesting. I'm going to share my screen So we move to a small, let's say, presentation as a support to start the dialogue. So basically the idea today, after this introduction, is really to have a dialogue together to try to guide participants of the webinar to raise the game in data analytics. So we're going to explore what are the key facets of an efficient data-driven transformation and what lessons can you take away. At the end of the dialogue, I will moderate a Q&A session. So I will see the question you pull into the comment section. So feel free to push your comments in LinkedIn or YouTube. And then we'll share that with Francesco. I will do the moderation. So we'll have 30 minutes duration of the webinar maximum. And then, of course, it will be recorded, so you'll be able to have access to that. So first of all, I would like to set the scene of the conversation. So we'll do a poll, okay? And to do the poll, that's very easy. You go to menti.com and you use the code 312184 as you see. So feel free to go to the web, menti.com, while you're watching and start putting your poll. Basically, we'd like to see if the audience, you are inactive in data analytics, so you just started, but you are on the beginning of the journey. If you are more at a descriptive level, mainly through BI, basically, so you have a dashboard and reportings. If you had a predictive level with a central data science team, or you consider yourself at a prescriptive level. So we have one descriptive, predictive, starting little by little. We need more sample to have useful data. So descriptive. So let's push a bit more. So for the moment, it makes sense, no? More descriptive. So you have started basically your initiative. You have collected data, mainly maybe transactional data, ERP data. You have started to build your own dashboards. Okay, wait a little bit more. So you can keep on voting, and we can go back to the slide a little bit to see if there is a difference before we move on. Okay, so mainly descriptive. I think it represents it correctly, basically the state of initiatives. So the idea and the transition from descriptive to predictive is not easy. So so Francesco, you were referring to data assets, to the tech landscape. So we'll go back to see if there is some movement in the poll later on. But let's move to the scene, basically. So interesting results. And moving forward, we're going to try to establish a little bit the drivers of progress along the analytical maturity. That's what I call the alignment of stars in data analytics, because in each of these steps, the progress in the last years has been really immense, basically, and very fast. First, the first component and the first facet is cloud. There is no doubt today on moving to the cloud or even to hybrid architectures. But moving from a legacy architecture to modern architecture is a big enabler of the transformation. It's a lower factor of productivity. What can be done in the cloud in few clicks to simplify is a huge factor of productivity of building products or building data products. For instance, fraud analytics, so analysis of fraud detection. That is one of the top use cases in data science. Today is available in Amazon Web Services, in SageMaker. So we have a lot of, let's say, building blocks or components that today are readily available on the cloud. Image recognition or tagging, for instance, same example. The second element is integration. In business, data is siloed in multiple sources. And now we are able to address this bottleneck by connecting through APIs, through just database connectors as well, data in multiple sources. By a better management of the data assets, by a better integration, also companies start to retrieve ownership on their data. For instance, in consumer goods, as Nestlé, companies purchase a lot of data, syndicated data, competitors' data, among multiple other data sources. If this data is siloed, companies lack the real ownership on the asset, as Francesco was saying. And for me, the logic of data assets and the integration of the data assets is very central. Then you have science, data science, the capacity to generate revenues from the transformation is directly related to your capacity to pile up use cases and multiple use cases and to reuse data and analytical assets through multiple use cases. It also has to see with democratization. Democratization means with which kind of tools do we build the use cases, but also who does build the use cases. So the logic of moving from a pure center of excellence to a multiple of users within the company is very central. And all that is related to organization, to governance, to the setup, to the skill, to the people, by assigning clear roles of users of data models, basically, but also establishing the clear guidelines of governance. So that's a little bit the initial dialogue we would like to have. So Francesco, I'm going back to you. In these pillars, for instance, in terms of clouds, what's your take on cloud? What's the level of deployment of infrastructure that you have at Nestlé?
So cloud is definitely a big enabler of the journey on on state-of-the-art analytics and data practice. I would say of course when it comes to cloud, we have different levels at which we can leverage the cloud. It's a infrastructure level, then at application level, at a platform level. But I would say there is definitely a common denominator across the different layers of cloud services, which is about flexibility, first of all, so that then every company, no matter the size, has the flexibility to scale up and down the type of capacity that is required from the infrastructure of the platform or from the platform's modules. Two is about flexibility also in terms of how cloud enables a more, let's say, data mesh model when it comes to data and analytics. So more of a federated way to deliver the analytics and data efforts in a big organization, as opposed to a fully centralized, fully centrally governed type of platform steering. And then there is a third one, which is actually pretty close to my heart, and I hope actually is close to the heart of everyone, which is also about how we generate efficiencies, also in terms of environmental impact, in the moment in which we start shifting more from data centers to cloud data centers, because then the level of optimization of the actual, let's say, consumption of hardware improves overall. So I think this would be the top three things that I do have in mind. And then, of course, we have all the topics linked to cloud in terms of applications, right? So whenever we think of software as a service type of solutions, also their cloud allows to understand more easily how you can adopt, adapt, and assemble certain solutions, as opposed to the more traditional buy or build dilemmas that many companies in the data domain would have.
Yeah, very interesting. The data mesh model is something that is getting some traction, yes, right now. And regarding integration now, how do you fight against the silos at Nestlé, or do you get back, for instance, data that we acquired on multiple instances, for instance? What's the progress you do here?
So on integration, first of all, I think it's important to share that at Nestlé we made a deliberate choice to actually have of actually having the integration practice. So what traditionally has been the middleware stack management in different organization, and we made a deliberate choice to merge that integration practice with the data analytics practice. So when we think about data, we really think about integration playing a key role, and we also see that the traditional spaces of process integration and data integration are really coming more and more to an overlapping type of discipline for a state-of-the-art analytics activity system. So when we come then to data integration, I think our take today is really about one fundamental thing, which has almost nothing to do with the technical implications on how we do the work, but it's really more linked to the topic of accountability. So how we define accountability around data. If we define accountability around data as a cross-functional accountability, where we identify who are the data product managers that are in charge of building end-to-end roadmaps for a given data assets, and then make it that data asset available and in a consistent state for usage from different consumption players, then that's what will enable us to really drive removal of functional silos when it comes to data. I think that's a key transformation element and a key transformation driver, because it all starts with that, with accountability. So if we define accountability and ownership at functional level, then you do not have the organizational structure to really deliver at scale that silos removal that you were talking about.
Yeah, very interesting, because we talk a lot about data silos, but it's also organizational silos, basically. It's not only about the data, but also the process and the functional areas. Yeah. So it has to see with the next topic about democratization. The more you give power to the functions, in fact, the more you want to accelerate towards a democratization. We speak a lot in class, for instance, of the movement from a center of excellence, really pure data scientists centralizing the effort, toward a more democratized approach to data, with also other figures. So data translator, for instance, people that do the connection between pure data science and the functional areas. So what's the stage of democratization necessary right now?
So, well, let me start with a number. First of all, since we are passionate about data, I think it's fair to also quote some data. So today we do have just within the Power BI user community, we have 40,000 users of self-service analytics capabilities at Nestlé. So that already is a number that speaks to the fact that we do believe in democratization of data capability and of analytics capabilities. Now, that said, I think it's never a black or white picture, meaning democratization should not mean, let's say, complete lack of governance on how you drive a capability development roadmap for analytics in a big organization, and should also not mean, though, that in order to establish that governance, you then lock and create bottlenecks that are systematic, that then do not allow the different, let's say, data citizens and analytics practitioners across the organization to really contribute and have the maximum impact that they could have with data. So that means that essentially we have taken really also here a deliberate approach of organizing ourselves in what the industry typically would call an hub and spoke model. So we do believe in having embedded analytics practitioners and data stewards in the different businesses, in the different markets, in the different functions of the company. But we also think that having an analytics center of excellence is a key enabler to then driving scale, not always on what we do, but scale in certain cases on how we do things. And I have to say, also talking about the heritage of the journey of digital transformation of the company of Nestlé, there is also this concept of freedom in a box that the team developed over the years, which is really about creating a structured approach to to what it means democratization. It's about defining the box, the strategy within which you want to develop analytics capabilities, but then making sure that you empower people, you empower professionals to have that freedom within the box to really maximize then the impact for the organization with data.
A very interesting concept. And that's true that at the end, interestingly, we have been talking about organization governance all along the different pillars at the end. So it means that with this progress that companies do in data analytics, the organization, the people, the governance, the accountability is at the core of the transformation. Going back a little bit to see a little bit the poll, so it's still the same. I'm going to stop sharing my screen to go back a little bit to the questions, and I will try to see if we have some questions for the audience. Maybe we can take a few questions before we give a conclusion here. So do you have comments?
And by the way, while we wait maybe for some comments or questions, if I look at the results of that poll, it's interesting also to see, the fact that the industry is still not at strong maturity level on prescriptive and predictive analytics has also a lot to do with the topic of scale, right? It's not just about being successful in having one-off success with the predictive or prescriptive use cases. It's more about having success in driving predictive analytics or prescriptive at scale and in an operationalized fashion, right?
Exactly. In your case, Francesco, the more complex steps, is it from nothing to descriptive? So 40,000 users of Power BI is huge. It's a huge already effort for the company, right? So because there is beyond a lot of efforts on data and so on. What is the biggest step? 0 to 1 or 1 to 2 or 3 or? So
I have to say it's quite a consistent journey in the case of Nestlé. I'd say when it comes to descriptive analytics, a lot of those data assets that I was mentioning before have been really the core. Nestlé has been managing the biggest business data warehouse landscape in the industry that was coming with ultimately embedded descriptive analytics layers. So I think it's really been a consistent journey. When it comes to predictive analytics, especially on the demand forecasting, there is a lot of efforts and a lot of acceleration that we're having. Now recently, we also publish our AI code of ethics, which is going to be also, if you want, the North Star on how we also make priority calls and make also decisions on focus areas on how we really enable also the prescriptive analytics and let's say the AI augmentation of all our capabilities.
We have a question from Angel Moreu about, so he's working on oncology research, so in clinical trials, so a context which is heavily with high regulation, basically. You're also exposed to regulation in your case in the food industry, obviously. So do you have any recommendation on how to accelerate when you are heavily constrained by regulation? That's a good question.
Yeah, so that's indeed very interesting, and it's also very much linked to the point of a code of ethics that I was mentioning. By the way, I really enjoyed my time, in the pharmaceutical industry. I spent about 3 years there, driving data analytics effort in the space. And I would say I would always put things in perspective in terms of, first of all, what are the constraints and where they come from? Because I think there are constraints that are very healthy, and it's good that we do have those constraints and that we, let's say, challenge ourselves to operate within those constraints, of course. Nevertheless, I think it's also about getting granular enough in interpreting those constraints. So then, we don't have a one size fits all policy, for example, around data that maybe apply simply the most restrictive type of policy to each and every use case that we deal with, instead of doing more granular work where we say, okay, this constraint is really applicable specifically to this and this area, but in reality would allow us more freedom to create value in other areas. So I think for me, the answer here is about, again, code of ethics as the North Star to manage data. And the second one is about granularity on how we make the assessment of the boundaries and of the opportunities that we can pursue.
Yeah, agree with that. And I think there is a direct relationship between regulatory constraints and maturity. Because you are constrained, you are pushed to go deeper and more granular and be more accurate on data. For banking, for instance, is one example. So I think there is a direct connection. We have another question from Irati from London saying, you mentioned data assets, and I think that's a key concept. It's very important. But she wonders if there is an interest in commercializing the assets. So, for instance, data sharing clusters with a retail customer. So there is a double logic in the question, sharing or commercializing data assets, but also a bigger take on sharing data with retailers, for instance. What's your view on that?
So I would say not necessarily today at the stage where we think about data products as commercial products that are actually part of the business model. Honestly, I don't think that's applicable today to where we are. I think this point is very interesting because it really talks about thinking data and data partnership, not in terms of organizational assets, but rather as digital ecosystem. So I think by now it's clear that in order to drive analytics and data consumption that is relevant, again, to create value for consumers, for employees, and for communities, it's not just about tapping into the data of one organization. It's really about creating a digital ecosystem based on data partnership that can be with retailers. It can be with different type of institutions. It could be across peer companies in a given industry, depending on the use case, right? So I think it's important that we pursue that. Let me say that sharing economy on data whenever it serves the purpose of building value. Of course, that's also one area where if I go back to the point that was coming before regarding regulatory, it's always important to do that, having a very clear assessment and due diligence on what are the data partnerships that we should pursue and what are the ones that add value within what are the regulatory constraints.
Great. Before we conclude this webinar, maybe a question. So we have we train hundreds of participants each year on data science for business. With this kind of angle. That's why I'm insisting a lot on democratization. So, what would be your advice for a young student in business training himself in Python, for instance, in cloud, as we do in the programs? What will be your advice for career development?
So that's a fantastic question, and actually I could speak 1 hour around it, but I will try to nail it down to probably three recommendations. And I tap honestly on the experience that I had the luck to be exposed to and had the opportunity to get exposed to myself throughout my career development. The first one is about making sure that everyone nurture the hands-on aspects of what it means to create value with data. This is not a domain where an helicopter view on things create value. So I think it's good to invest in self-development when it comes to tools, platforms, techniques, again, hands-on keyboard to really understand what it means to build value with data. The second one is about having the awareness that we need to be, let's say, unicorns and multidisciplinary actors if we want to be successful in the data analytics space and we want to drive impact in the space, which means it's always important that we create the preconditions for us to learn a new domain every time. And when I talk about domain, I mean, it can be a domain in a given business around commercial processes. It could be a domain within another business within the operation space, or could be, in topics linked to even to society, what it means to master public policy rather than data privacy policies, rather than, if you think about the recent crisis that we're managing, what it means to understand a process, a problem, so that then we have all the tools to address it. So domain expertise and a framework to develop knowledge on a given domain is important. Also there, staying too much high level doesn't create value. And then the last one is really about investing in communication. By the way, I think in all these three areas, I can claim that I keep the bar very high even for myself. I would never be satisfied enough on how I would invest in these three areas. And communication is always also one of them, because a key elements of the end-to-end journey to produce data, to produce value with data, is about storytelling. It's about how you tell the story the data want to tell. And communication becomes a key enabler of that. So I would definitely also relentlessly invest in how we communicate, verbally, written, and in any form and context.
Thank you very much, Francesco. So thank you. That concludes a little bit our webinar. It was short and dense, about key elements. So thank you very much for the audience. Thank you so much, Francesco. It's always a pleasure to share these moments with you, to discuss so openly about your experience. I think it has been of huge value for everybody. It will be available through a recording, so replay. So I think we will have a live after this webinar. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Manu. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.